Today, we're digging into the American experiment, looking at this really interesting gap between the country's founding ideals and its present-day reality. So let's get right into it. Okay, it all starts with this one powerful idea right from the Declaration of Independence. It's the absolute bedrock of American democracy. A government's power comes from the people it governs. That's the promise.
So that's the promise, right? But here's the question we're really going to explore today. Does that promise, that consent of the governed, actually apply to everyone living under the American flag?
First, let's just quickly break down what that promise really is by looking at the core documents, the ones known as the Charters of Freedom. It all kicks off in 1776 with the Declaration, this bold statement saying, we're in charge of ourselves now. Then, in 1787, you get the Constitution, which is basically the blueprint for how the government is supposed to work. And just a few years later, in 1791, they add the Bill of Rights to make sure individual freedoms are protected and the government can't overstep. So, when you put all three together, you get this incredibly powerful promise, a government that is supposed to be built on the will of the people, with its main job being to protect the rights of its citizens. That is the ideal. Okay, so that's the ideal. Now let's get into the reality, and this is where things get complicated. We're going to look at something that many Americans might not even be aware of. Check out this number, 3.6 million. I mean, let that sink in for a second. That's more people than live in 20 different U.S. states, and all of them live under U.S. sovereignty, but not in one of the 50 states. They live in U.S. territories. And here are the 5 main ones. You got Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands over in the Caribbean, and then way out in the Pacific, you have Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. Now, you probably noticed that key word in the last column for every single one of them, unincorporated. So what does that even mean? Well, basically, an unincorporated territory is a place where the U.S. Constitution doesn't automatically apply in full. Instead, it's up to Congress to decide which parts of the Constitution, which rights and protections actually extend to the people living there. This status is really the key to the whole story. All right, so let's really unpack this. What does this unincorporated status, this sort of citizenship with an asterisk, actually mean for the millions of people who call these places home? This is probably the most shocking part. For all 3.6 million of these residents, even though they're governed by the U.S. president, they cannot vote in the election to choose that president. No vote. And it gets even more layered than that. See, while people in most territories are U.S. citizens by birth, there's a big exception, American Samoa. People born there are considered U.S. nationals, not citizens. Now, this status helps protect indigenous land and culture, but it also means they aren't automatically citizens and have to go through the whole naturalization process if they want to become one.
So, yeah, this brings us right back to that fundamental question, doesn't it? If your whole system is based on the consent of the governed, how do you explain millions of people who are governed but have absolutely no say in choosing their leader?
You know, this whole situation with the territories, it's not some isolated issue. It actually points to some bigger challenges happening within the entire American system. And to get a sense of that, let's look at a recent report card on U.S. democracy from Freedom House. Basically, what the report is saying is that even though the U.S. has this really strong foundation, things have been, well, eroding lately. They point to stuff like intense political polarization, a lot of pressure being put on the election process, and these huge growing gaps in wealth and influence. And here's the number they landed on, 84 out of 100. Now, that's still considered free, but it does put the U.S. behind a lot of other well-established democracies. So let's see why. So, how do they get to that 84? It's broken down into 2 main parts: political rights and civil liberties. And as you can see, while the score is still pretty high, there are definitely some points being knocked off in both areas. And when you dig into why the score is what it is, the report highlights some pretty big issues. Things like gerrymandering, where districts are drawn for political advantage, the crazy amount of money in politics, a justice system that's under a lot of strain, and those growing inequalities we talked about. And you can see how, when all this is going on at a national level, it becomes really easy for the rights of 3.6 million people in territories to just get lost in the shuffle. So, you've got the beautiful promise on one hand, and this messy, complicated reality on the other. It really drives home that the American experiment was never a finished product. It's a story that's still being written, and it's always evolving. And things can change, sometimes in ways you really don't see coming. A great example of this is the CIA World Factbook.
For over 60 years, this thing was a rock-solid public source of information for the whole world. It went from being classified to being printed to being this incredible online tool. And then, poof, in 2026, it was just gone.
Look, on the surface, the end of a government website might not seem like a huge deal, but it's a powerful symbol, right? It shows how things we take for granted, whether it's easy access to information or even the fundamental right to vote, aren't necessarily permanent. They can be fragile. And that's really the story of the American experiment, isn't it? It's this constant push and pull between its incredible ideals and its often messy realities. The big question, the one that remains unanswered, is how do you make consent of the governed a reality for everyone when millions living under the flag still don't have a voice?